Samson, a figure divinely appointed, was renowned for single-handedly vanquishing entire armies. Yet his strength and might ultimately succumbed to the wiles of a captivating and seductive woman. While slumbering in her lap, Delilah, in a moment of betrayal, sheared off the very locks that were the source of his power, delivering Samson into the clutches of his mortal enemies. But the question that lingers through the ages is, what truly motivated Delilah's treachery? Was it mere avarice, a primal fear, or something even more sinister lurking in the depths of her heart? This is the saga of Israel's most formidable hero, a man who, in a moment of profound weakness, forfeited everything he held dear. This narrative unfolds during a dark epoch in Israel's history, a time when the oppressive weight of Philistine rule seemed unbearable. The Philistines, an implacable foe, were relentless in their aggression. Their armies relentlessly raided villages, plundering harvests and sowing seeds of terror among the Israelite populace. It was amidst this atmosphere of pervasive dread that a man emerged, a figure seemingly invulnerable to harm: Samson. He was more than just a warrior, more than just an ordinary man. Samson was a living legend, a beacon of hope for the Israelites and a source of dread for the Philistines. Even before his birth, Samson was destined for greatness, an integral part of a much grander divine design. His story began in a time of profound sorrow for his family. Manoah, his father, and his wife, a woman whose name is unfortunately lost to the annals of history, lived under the shadow of infertility. They were childless, and in that era, such a state was considered almost a curse, a sign of divine displeasure. Manoah's fervent prayers for an heir seemed to fall on deaf ears, lost in the vastness of the heavens. But then, one ordinary day, something extraordinary transpired. The woman was in the field, perhaps tending to her daily chores, when a man of unusual appearance materialized before her. His eyes possessed an uncanny brilliance, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to solidify the very earth beneath her feet. "You are barren and have never had children," he declared, "but you will conceive and give birth to a son. He will be a Nazirite, consecrated to God from the womb until the day of his death. This boy will be the deliverer of Israel from the hands of the Philistines." This divine proclamation was not merely good news. It was a sacred calling, a life sentence, a destiny etched in the stars. And so, Samson was born, bearing within him the weight of a divine promise. From his earliest years, he knew he was different, set apart from his peers. Other children could run free and unburdened, but he had restrictions and responsibilities. They could cut their hair without consequence, but his locks were destined to grow, a constant reminder that his life was not his own. He was not simply a boy, he was the chosen one, the one destined to break the chains of oppression. But with this extraordinary privilege came an equally extraordinary burden, the responsibility of carrying on his shoulders not only his own life, but the destiny of the entire people of Israel. God had consecrated him as a liberator, a warrior, destined to confront the Philistines, the brutal oppressors who had subjugated Israel for far too long. The Nazirite vow was not merely a set of rules. It was a sacred symbol of his direct connection to the divine. His hair, which was never to be cut, was a visible testament to this covenant. Each strand that grew was a constant reminder that his life belonged not to himself, but to God. And as long as he remained faithful to this sacred vow, Samson would remain invincible, a force of nature against the Philistine tide. However, to break this covenant would mean more than simply losing his physical strength. It would signify losing the connection to the very purpose for which he had been called into existence. It would be a spiritual amputation, severing him from his destiny. As Samson matured, he rapidly distinguished himself from his peers. He was immensely strong, his arms resembling the trunks of ancient trees, and his eyes possessed a piercing, gaze that seemed to penetrate the very souls of those he beheld. But what truly set him apart was not merely his physical prowess. It was the divine strength that flowed through him, a force he wielded to protect his people and confront the Philistines with unwavering courage. There came a day when Samson, utterly alone, faced what seemed like an insurmountable challenge. 1,000 Philistine soldiers, armed to the teeth, surrounded him in an open field. The ground trembled beneath the weight of their boots, and the glint of their blades reflected the scorching sun. They laughed, confident that their overwhelming numerical superiority would be more than sufficient to crush the man who had dared to defy them on so many occasions. But Samson refused to yield, his eyes burning with a fierce determination that defied the odds. He scanned the field around him, searching for a weapon, any tool that could aid him in his desperate fight. There were no swords, no spears, no shields. Within reach, only what appeared to be the jawbone of a donkey, discarded on the parched ground. He picked it up, feeling the weight of the crude, rustic weapon in his hands. It was a meager tool against such a vast and formidable force, but it was all he had. And then, without a hint of fear or hesitation, Samson charged headlong into the heart of the Philistine army, his resolve unwavering. The first blow was devastating, crushing the helmet of a soldier and felling him to the ground like an empty sack. Before the others could even react, Samson had already swung the jawbone again, striking down 2 more soldiers. The chaos that ensued was absolute. The screams of the wounded echoed across the field as the Philistines began to realize that they were not facing an ordinary man. This was not simply a battle. It was a confrontation with something beyond their comprehension. The jawbone crashed against shields and shattered bones with the force of a thunderclap. Samson was relentless. His movements were swift and brutal, like a tempest that none could withstand. Each blow was precise, as if guided by the very hand of God. The Philistines, who had arrived with such arrogance and confidence, began to retreat in panic, their carefully laid plans crumbling around them. But there was nowhere to run. The field that had once been a stage for war was rapidly transforming into a graveyard. When the carnage finally subsided, Samson stood panting, the blood of his enemies staining the ground around him. 1,000 men lay dead, their weapons scattered and their bodies broken. The jawbone, now splintered and cracked, still dangled from his hand, a testament to the sheer force he had unleashed. The news of this astonishing victory spread like wildfire. Throughout the territories, the Israelites hailed him as a savior, a living embodiment of the divine strength that still resided among them. He was their champion, their hope against the encroaching darkness. But for the Philistines, Samson was not merely a man. He was a curse, a plague upon their land, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. They began to devise a plan to end his life once and for all, to extinguish the flame of rebellion that he had ignited. Under the cloak of darkness, a small Israelite village was surrounded by Philistine soldiers, their faces grim and their intentions deadly. They knew that Samson was there, resting in one of the houses, and they were determined to capture him. With torches in hand and swords at the ready, the soldiers moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the darkness. "This time, he will not escape," whispered the leader of the squad, his voice filled with a mixture of anticipation and hatred. The leader raised his hand, giving the signal to advance. The soldiers cautiously approached the house, their hearts pounding in their chests. The door creaked ominously as one of them pushed it open, bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation. And then, with a sudden burst of violence, the door swung open with a resounding crash. In the doorway, Samson appeared, his towering figure silhouetted against the flickering light of the torches. For a moment, the soldiers froze, unable to believe their eyes. The silence was shattered by a primal war cry, but it did not emanate from the throats of the Philistines. It was the roar of Samson, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. What happened next would become the stuff of legends among the Israelites and a recurring nightmare for the Philistines. The battle that ensued would test the limits of human endurance and showcase the extraordinary power that resided within Samson. But even with his immense strength, could Samson possibly overcome such a carefully planned ambush? The soldiers surged forward, their swords raised high and their faces contorted with the determination to end the terror that Samson had become. But Samson did not hesitate. With a lightning-fast movement, he seized the first soldier who dared to enter the house and hurled him against the others as if he weighed no more than a child. The impact created a momentary opening, but the Philistines refused to yield. They surrounded the house from all sides, pressing in like a relentless wave, determined to engulf their target. Samson realized that he was trapped, outnumbered, and surrounded. He knew that the strength of his enemies lay not only in their numbers, but also in the burning hatred they harbored for him and his people. For a fleeting moment, even he, the man chosen by God, felt a pang of fear, a flicker of doubt in his unwavering resolve. Then his eyes fell upon a weapon, a tool of salvation, that lay almost unnoticed in the corner of the house. A wooden beam, dislodged from the structure, lay on the floor, discarded like a piece of debris. With a single fluid motion, he lifted the beam as if it were a mere toy, its weight insignificant in his hands. He charged forward, wielding the beam with devastating force. The beam crushed shields and shattered spears as the Philistines desperately tried to defend themselves. Each blow sent tremors through the house, and the screams of the wounded and dying echoed into the night, painting a gruesome tableau of war. The Philistines began to falter, their courage eroding under the relentless assault. For the first time, the terror etched on their faces outweighed the courage they had brought with them. They realized that they were not merely facing a man. They were facing something that none of them could fully comprehend. When the battle finally ended, the floor of the house was littered with fallen soldiers. Some moaned in agony, their bodies broken and bleeding. Others lay still, their lives extinguished in the brutal conflict. Samson, sweating profusely and gasping for breath, surveyed the scene, clutching the wooden beam like a sacred sword. The dust began to settle, revealing him standing alone amidst the carnage. It was always like this. Victory brought silence, and silence brought solitude. The Israelites might acclaim him as a hero, but no one truly understood the immense burden he carried. He was feared by his enemies and revered by his people, but who could truly know him? Who could see the man behind the strength? And it was in this profound solitude that Delilah entered his life. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, it was in this solitude that Samson allowed her to enter, a fateful decision that he would come to regret with every fiber of his being. Delilah was unlike any woman Samson had ever encountered. It was not merely her stunning beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful, with a radiant aura that seemed to make the sun shine brighter simply to illuminate her. There was something more, a deep mystery in her eyes, a magnetic allure that made even Samson, the man who faced entire armies without flinching, feel vulnerable and exposed. But who was Delilah really? The scriptures provide few details about her origins or her motivations. Was she simply a woman driven by greed, seduced by the promises of silver offered by the Philistine leaders? Or was she pressured, perhaps fearing that if she refused to collaborate, she herself would suffer dire consequences? Perhaps Delilah saw in Samson not a man, but a means to achieve power and security, a pawn in her own ambitious game. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. She was cunning and astute, and she possessed a keen ability to exploit Samson's emotional vulnerabilities in ways that no other enemy had ever managed to do. To Samson, Delilah seemed to be the only person who did not see him as merely a warrior or a weapon. She treated him as a man, with his own vulnerabilities, his own hopes, and his own fears. He found solace and comfort in her arms, a sanctuary from the constant pressure and the relentless battles. But he did not realize that this comfort was a carefully constructed trap, a silken web designed to ensnare him. In the beginning, Delilah asked nothing about Samson's strength. She waited patiently for the right moment, slowly building trust and forging a bond of intimacy. And when she sensed that he was completely enamored with her, she began her carefully orchestrated advance. "Samson," she would say, her voice soft and alluring, "you are so strong, but what if one day you weren't? What if one day your strength should fail you? Is there anything that makes you weak, anything that can diminish your power?" It was a simple question, almost innocently posed, but Samson felt a strange unease creep into his heart. He laughed nervously, trying to deflect the conversation. "If I were bound with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried," he joked, "I would become as weak as any other man." That night, as he slept soundly, Delilah put his words to the test. She bound him tightly with 7 fresh bowstrings and then called out to the Philistines, who were lying in wait. But when Samson awoke, he snapped the bowstrings as if they were mere threads of hair. The Philistines fled in terror, and Delilah, with a carefully crafted expression of feigned innocence, pretended not to understand what had happened. "Why did you deceive me, Samson?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of hurt. "If you truly love me, tell me the truth. What is the secret of your strength?" Samson, in his naivete, had no idea that with each lie, with each act of deception, he was walking further and further into a deadly trap. Because in that quiet house, a sinister game of cat and mouse was underway, a game with stakes far higher than he could possibly imagine. That silence wasn't just from the game. This was about a plan much larger in the works, and what would happen in the coming nights would put at risk not just his life, but the future of a whole nation. Delilah tried again, each time with increasing urgency. On another night, he said, "If I am bound with new ropes that have never been used, my strength will leave me." Once again, she waited until he had fallen asleep and then bound him tightly with new ropes. Once again, she called for the Philistines, who were lurking in the shadows. But Samson broke free with ease. The ropes snapped like fragile threads, and the Philistines fled in panic. How often do we allow ourselves to be deceived, believing that we are in control of everything? Like Samson, we ignore the warning signs, and we continue to trust the wrong people, the wrong things, until it is far too late. Delilah did not need Samson's strength to defeat him. She used something far more subtle: persistence, manipulation, and a calculated appeal to his heart. This is how so many traps are sprung, not with direct attacks, but with whispered words that lull us into lowering our guard. Delilah was frustrated. She knew that she could not afford to fail. But Samson was a clever man, or perhaps it was his growing love for her that made him wary. He was reluctant to reveal his true secret, but Delilah's relentless persistence began to wear him down. Deep down, she knew that it was not just his physical strength that she needed to break, it was his spirit. And so, Delilah played her final card. She wept, accusing him of not truly loving her, of withholding the truth from her. Each tear, each word was carefully calculated to strike at Samson where it hurt the most, in his heart. "If you love me," she sobbed, "why don't you trust me? Why don't you tell me what truly makes you strong? Or is it that you don't feel for me what I feel?" For you, it was an emotional assault, something that even Samson's extraordinary strength could not resist for long. And then, on one fateful night, he finally yielded. "My strength does not come from me," he confessed, his voice heavy with resignation. "It comes from God. My hair has never been cut because it is the sign of my vow to him. If my hair is cut, my strength will vanish, and I will become like any other man." Delilah listened to his words intently, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and anticipation. She showed no outward reaction, merely smiled faintly and waited for him to fall asleep. When she was certain that Samson was completely lost in slumber, she summoned a man to shear off his 7 braids, one by one. As each lock of Samson's hair fell to the ground, his divine strength slowly ebbed away. He felt nothing in the moment, lost in the oblivion of sleep. But upon awakening, he sensed that something was terribly wrong. The Philistines were there, surrounding him, their faces filled with malice and triumph, ready to capture him. He tried to react, to unleash his legendary strength against his captors, but his body refused to obey. He, who had once single-handedly defeated 1,000 men, was now weak and impotent, a mere shadow of his former self. When the Philistines stormed into the house that night, Samson was no longer the invincible warrior they had feared for so long. He struggled to rise, to fight back, but his legs buckled beneath him. The iron chains they had brought were hardly necessary. Even without them, Samson would have been unable to escape. The hero of Israel, the man whose strength was a symbol of divine protection, was now prostrate on the floor, utterly helpless. Delilah had achieved what she had set out to do, but little did she know that her treachery had sown the seeds of a divine vengeance, a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of the Philistine empire. In the moment of Samson's downfall, something within him awakened, a dormant spark of faith and determination that had been buried beneath layers of pride and arrogance. What he did next, even blind and weakened, may have been the greatest act of strength and faith he had ever performed. Prepare yourself for a conclusion more epic than you could ever imagine. A final stand that would cement Samson's legacy as a hero for all time. Delilah watched from afar, concealed in the shadows, her face unreadable. Her expression was grave, almost devoid of emotion. But there was something flickering in her eyes, a fleeting glimpse of something hidden deep within her soul. Perhaps it was regret, perhaps it was relief, perhaps it was simply the crushing weight of knowing that her role in this unfolding drama was finally complete. Why did she do it? Was it solely for the money, the lure of the silver promised by the Philistine leaders? Perhaps. But the truth is, no one knows for certain what truly transpired in the depths of her heart. Delilah was a complex woman, caught in a web of conflicting loyalties and motivations. She lived in a borderland, in the valley of Sorek, a region situated between Israel and the Philistine territories. Perhaps she felt pressured, fearing that if she refused the offer from the Philistine leaders, she herself would become a target of their wrath. Or perhaps she genuinely chose to betray Samson, not out of love for the Philistines, but as a means to achieve something greater: wealth, power, security. The Philistines, in their blind fury and insatiable desire for revenge, were not content with merely capturing Samson. They dragged him to Gaza, the fortress city of their enemies, and there they began to systematically humiliate him, stripping him of his dignity and reducing him to a spectacle of defeat. First, they gouged out his eyes, a cruel and barbaric act that was also deeply symbolic. They wanted to ensure that Samson would never again see the light of day, that he would never again gaze upon the land he had sworn to protect. They wanted to extinguish the fire in his eyes, to break his spirit and render him utterly powerless. Then they forced him to work as a millstone grinder, toiling day and night like a common animal, his once mighty muscles straining under the weight of the heavy stone. Day after day, Samson was forced to push the heavy stone, mocked and taunted by his captors, his humiliation complete. He, who had once torn down the gates of cities and defeated entire armies, was now reduced to a blind slave, endlessly turning, a wheel in the darkness, his life stripped of all meaning and purpose. But Samson's captivity was not merely a punishment. It was also a period of profound reflection, a time of spiritual awakening that would ultimately lead him to his destiny. Without the light of day to guide his footsteps, Samson began to see with a clarity he had never possessed before. He realized that his true strength had never resided in his muscles or his hair, but in the presence of God, in his life, in his unwavering faith and obedience to the divine will. He understood that he had squandered his gifts, that he had allowed pride and arrogance to cloud his judgment and lead him astray. While his enemies reveled in his downfall, something significant was happening in the silence of his captivity. His hair, the symbol of his covenant with God, began to grow again, slowly but surely. And with each strand that sprouted, Samson felt a renewal of faith, a reawakening of his spirit. He understood that he had failed, that he had strayed from the path, but he also realized that God had not abandoned him, that his divine purpose was not yet complete. While Samson toiled away in the mill, blind and humiliated, no one paid attention to something that seemed so insignificant. His hair was gradually growing back. To the Philistines, it meant nothing. It was merely a cosmetic detail, irrelevant to his captivity. But to Samson, each day of silence and darkness brought with it a growing sense of hope, a feeling that something was changing, that the tide was about to turn. And it was in this silence, far from the shouts and adulation of men, that God's plan began to unfold in a way that no one could have imagined, setting the stage for the most dramatic and awe-inspiring act of redemption in the history of Israel.